Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you the 10 best creatures for Genesis Part 2. But just before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe as it really does help out the channel. In at number 10 is the Astrocetus. Now I know this is a Genesis Part 1 creature, but this can also be found on Genesis Part 2 as well. And it is an extremely useful creature for a lot of the things that you'll be doing in Genesis Part 2. And it actually isn't too bad for getting that harvesting done in the space biome, as this thing has a lot of weight, but there's one other space creature which will probably do a lot better than what the Astrocetus is going to do. But I still think it has a very valid use in Genesis Part 2, and it is a reasonable creature for just traveling around and getting all of your resources from place to place quite easily. And considering its size, you can just haul everything in one go easily with no problem at all. Also, you may say the Astrocetus is really slow, but with its teleporting abilities and other abilities like that, the Astrocetus isn't actually too slow of a creature. In at number 9 is the Snowowl. Now for every map, the Snowowl I would say is an essential tame, and nothing changes with Genesis Part 2. The Snowowl's immense use for so many things just make this thing useful on any kind of map, and with many of Genesis Part 2's things, the Snowowl is an incredibly useful creature. Firstly, the Snowowl can get you across the large expansive map that is Genesis Part 2. Yes, it may not be the biggest arc map out there, but it definitely does take a while to traverse, and a Snowowl will do that very effectively for you with that famous gliding ability, which it also does share with the Griffin. But also in terms of a PvP scenario, these things are actually very decent as well, as they have this sort of heat seeking ability where they can see any creature giving off heat, which makes this thing extremely useful in a PvP scenario when someone is trying to raid your base, or they have raided your base and they're trying to get away. It just means you can easily spot them and where they're going, and then you can dispose of them as you wish from there. But in terms of the Snowowl, you are going to want to level up all of that stamina, as it has another ability up its sleeve. This thing can heal creatures. Yes, very similarly to the Daedon, except it will only heal within its radius, and also it will heal any kind of creature, so do take that into mind. It is not just going to heal your own Tames. In at number 8 is the RG, or the Argentavis. Now on every map, again, the RG is an extremely useful creature, which is really great for metal gathering, and metal will still be a very important part of your playing on Genesis Part 2. Yes, you start with a tech suit, so getting to the mountain is much easier, but your character still will not have the insane weight stat and weight reduction that the Argentavis has. And with the Argentavis's speed overall, this thing is an extremely useful creature for getting all of that metal from the mountains back to your base, because yes, getting to the mountains, like I said, isn't really a problem when you're using the tech suit in Genesis Part 2. Also, the RG is just extremely useful for taming as well, as this thing can go around and pick up a wealth of creatures, especially if you're picking up an Anki. If you have a tamed Anki and you pick it up, you can just hover it over metal and it will harvest it instantly for you. Also, if you're wondering about what resources the RG has weight reduction on, obviously it has weight reduction on metal, but it also has weight reduction on things like crystal and obsidian as well, just for all of that extra bonus. On top of that, its saddle works as a portable smithy, which is really useful, and it has a secret hidden ability. When it eats a dead body, it will regen insanely quickly. In at number 7 is the Giga, or in this case, I'm going to be talking about the Giga, as the Giga is something in Genesis Part 2 which is an extremely useful creature, which actually may put it ahead of the Argentavis in most things. The Giga really is just an insane upgrade on the Giga. Yes, it may not be the biggest upgrade in the world, but it really does make the difference overall, especially on a map like Genesis Part 2, where you require all of this power. The extra damage reduction and damage dealing is absolutely essential to this creature's success. Yes, the original Giga is still an absolute beast, but if you are looking to tame a Giga, definitely try and look for that R variant. It's the same on Genesis Part 1 when you have the X variants of creatures like the Rex and the Aloe. Yes, the normal variants are still very good and worth taming, but if you can shell out for them, shell out for the R or X variants of creatures. They really just make your dino experience so much better, and they aren't too much more difficult to tame, especially if they are a passive tame like the Basilosaurus. The only main difference is they will have damage reduction, and I think they have boosted damage as well, and I think it is 125% boosted stats, which again really is actually an insane boost. You're getting an extra quarter out of your creature, which doesn't seem like a lot, but trust me, when you see it, it is a lot, and it is definitely worth the extra effort required to get yourself an Giga on Genesis Part 2. In at number 6 is the Deinonychus. Now overall, yes, you are going to need to transfer this creature from Valguero to actually be able to use this thing on Genesis Part 2, but I would really urge you to do this, or you can use a creature which is further on the list. The Deinonychus is just such a good tame and an amazing boss creature that it is insanely worth it for Genesis Part 2. The fact that it can latch onto large things and rip them and deal so much bleed damage is essential. Except I don't think you're going to be doing that to Rockwell on Genesis Part 2, as I don't think that would work. But either way, with their pack buffs, when they are in a pack, these things are insanely useful for bosses, even if you can't latch onto said boss to deal all of that bleed damage. But I'm not sure if you can latch onto the tentacles or not. If you could, that would be useful, but still their damage really does rack up on base, so they will be totally fine. If you have a good decent pack of 10 or more, you should easily be able to face Rockwell with little problems at all. Also, on top of all of that, unlike many other carnivores, these things have really good agility, which actually makes them significantly better combat creatures, as a thing like the Rex doesn't have a great turning circle and can get easily stuck, whereas the Deinonychus can quickly get out of a situation that it simply doesn't want to be in. So if you are being brutally attacked by the enemy and you needed to quickly heal somewhere else, you could quickly dash away. And this is also great out of a boss situation when you're just trying to travel the maps that is Genesis Part 2. In at number 5 is the Reaper. Now, if you didn't know already, the Reaper can be your first tame on Genesis Part 2. Yes, your first tame on the map, which is absolutely insane, as on Operation, there is pretty much no easy, cheat, hacky way to tame the Reaper. But how do you do it on Genesis Part 2? Well, you'll need to find where the Reapers spawn, and then from there, near where they spawn in one area, there is a pool of kind of gas, which will deal all of that damage for you. And because you have tech, you can simply loom above easily with no hassle at all and no worries of actually being dealt damage from the Reaper. Then once the Reaper has reached that signature glow state, then you'll simply lure it out of that gas and get impregnated by it, and then if you want to, you can get all the XP to actually get a higher effectiveness version, but that really is not going to matter for your first tame, especially on a map like Genesis Part 2, because a Reaper is going to shred through most of the creatures on that map, as there isn't too many hostile creatures on the map that deal immense amounts of damage like on Operation. I would definitely say Operation is a much more hostile map, especially on Genesis Part 2 when you're in the Eden zones instead of in Rockwell's Gardens. The Reaper is definitely a tame on Genesis Part 2, worth taming. In at number 4 is the Astrod Delphia. Now, when I was talking about the Astrocetus earlier, I talked about this other creature that is in the space biome of Genesis Part 2, and that is the Astrod Delphia. Now, on many levels, the Astrod Delphia is vastly superior to anything the Astrocetus could do, apart from travelling loads of resources around, as the Astrocetus' weight is much better than the Astrod Delphia. But in terms of combat and absolute speed and agility, the Astrod Delphia really does take the win there. The Astrod Delphia is by far one of the fastest ways to travel around the Genesis Part 2 map, and also with all of its tricks and abilities, this is just a really fun and cool creature to use, which I definitely do urge you to tame, and overall it isn't too bad. It may seem expensive on paper that you need elements to tame this thing, but on Genesis Part 2, element really is not a problem. On Genesis Part 2, it is just so easy to get element, it simply isn't a problem. The only real problem is the actual taming of the creature, as sometimes when they're in packs, they can be really annoying and you can struggle to get to the Astrod Delphia you're taming, and also the Astrod Delphia can turn aggressive if you accidentally tech fist boost into them, which sounds like it won't happen, but sometimes it definitely will. Also, be careful of all those void worms waiting to kill your Astrod Delphia. In at number 3 is the Bloodstalker. Now again, like the Astrocetus, this is a Genesis Part 1 creature, but it does spawn on Genesis Part 2 as well. And what a creature the Bloodstalker is. This thing is by far one of the best travel mounts in Ark just ever in history of the game. But also on top of all of that, the Bloodstalker is much easier to tame now if you have ready access to something like the Desmodus, which if you transfer over from Fjorda, you will have a really good time, as you can simply get all of those blood bags and tame yourself a really high level Bloodstalker with absolute ease. And once you have a high level, you have yourself a creature that can rip across the map, as long as you do know how to control it. And I'm not the best person, to say the least, at controlling a Bloodstalker, but I was a lot better about 2 years ago when I did readily practice using the Bloodstalker. I'm definitely a bit rusty now. But either way, with the Bloodstalker, it is still an insanely useful skill to learn. And if you do have Ark and access to a Bloodstalker, I really do urge you to go out there and tame yourself a Bloodstalker and then learn how to use one. Especially if you're playing a map like Genesis Part 1 or Genesis Part 2, as a lot of hexagons can be warranted from learning this skill, as on Genesis Part 1 there are bog races, and on Genesis Part 2 there are races that include many creatures like the Bloodstalker as well, but they can also just be useful for many other missions on the map as well, and just for general travel. But hexagons really are a big aim in Genesis Part 1 and Genesis Part 2, so especially on Gen 1, Bloodstalker's great for hexagons. In at number 2 is the Shadowman. Now what would you expect from a Genesis Part 2 top 10? The Shadowman is one of Genesis Part 2's highlight creatures and is by far the way to go for the Rockwell boss on Genesis Part 2, no questions asked. Compared to the Deinonychus, the Shadowmans have even more agility, being able to jump to insane heights, and also on top of that they have a wealth of abilities the Deinonychus simply doesn't have. Firstly, they do share the pack buff like the Deinonychus, but they also have the hydration buff like the Spinosaurus, and on top of all of that they have many other buffs as well, like being able to turn invisible and also being able to charge up their damage to deal even more when they attack. And on top of all of that, they are insanely good swimmers as well. Their only real downside to the Shadowman is how absolutely freaking annoying the Shadowman is to actually tame. The amount of failed attempts you will probably go through to tame yourself a Shadowman is immense, and you will definitely get angry in the process of taming. And finally, in at number 1 is the Mwing. Now what would you expect from me, a PvE Ark player? If you're a PvP player, I would definitely understand why you put the Shadowman in the number 1 spot, and the Mwing would be further back on the list. But for me, a PvE Ark player of Genesis Part 2, I really like this creature, and it is by far the fastest creature for doing any kind of travel in Ark, no questions asked. Compared to the Rock Drake's Glide, this thing just seems to be so much faster and also so much easier to control. That is partly because I do practice a lot with this compared to the Rock Drake, but the gliding on this thing just seems so much more precise, and also just a lot quicker as well. You can absolutely zip across the map with one of these things. Also, these things have a wealth of other abilities as well that don't just include travel. Mainly, these things are great for raising up creatures, as they are an essentially portable feeding trough. and they can also steal enemy creatures that are still being raised. If you were doing a raid and you were raiding with one of these things, you could quickly nip up all of the enemy baby creatures that are still alive. So if you play Genesis Part 2, I really do urge you to tame a Mwing. They are simply the best. But anyway, that is the end of today's video. And did you agree? If you didn't, that's fine. You're entitled to your own opinion, and you can comment your top 10 in the description down below. Sorry I didn't mention the Strider or the Void Worm, but I will see you all later. Bye.